to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. This week we're joined by Hergrim, a flair and moderator on the subreddit, who is here to talk about the subject of women in medieval warfare. Welcome.
Hello.
So, there's a story my dad likes to tell that when he was young, he was once told that his aunt was a middle-aged woman, and being a child who didn't know many words at the time, he thought, hang on, does this mean she goes around walking in a suit of armour? Which is my segue into, so actually, how common was this?
So, women wearing armour was probably more common than women actually fighting. In a number of instances, women would actually wear armour as a symbol of their authority. It's like, I am, in armour like you guys, I can command you. Actual cases of women fighting in armour is not particularly common. There's only really a handful that we can verify. Women fighting without armour is actually probably more common. So you've got, of course, the usual women defending in sieges, and there's some medieval sources don't really talk about women much in the context of warfare, but we have some instances where we know that women participated in raids on enemy camps, slaughtered enemy soldiers trying to get through their camp, and probably looking at examples from the early modern period. Women would often act as pillagers for the army, and probably medieval women did the same thing, which means that if they had enough to take a small group of men, well, yeah, they'd be perfectly willing to cut them down.
Right, so I think that gives us a bit of a brief overview schema, and before we recorded this episode, you gave me a brief list of things you'd like to cover, and I think one of the first things you discussed is that there are women who fought deliberately, women who fought because of the situation, women who acted in supporting roles, and then finally there's sort of relationships between women and soldiers. So if we look at that first one, so what sorts of women would fight deliberately, and what would lead someone to voluntarily fight? Now, did this differ heavily from men, or is it just a matter of scale?
Well, the problem is we don't really know too much. Like I said earlier, not much gets recorded about women who fought. Probably the best attested woman who we know fought for sure was Maria of Purzuli, because Petrarch wrote a letter about her in 1343, and I think she's the only female soldier who we have someone writing about her when she lived, which is interesting because she's mentioned in some 15th century Italian sources. The Petrarch suggests that she was very, very well known in Italy, but he's the only one to even refer to her. Probably in her case, her motives for fighting were the same as the other men. She's recorded as fighting in the very, very internecine wars between the Italian city-states. So, of course, Petrarch knew her before she became a soldier. And he mentions that when she came up to him in the street, after she'd been serving for a few years as a woman-at-arms, so to speak, he had absolutely no idea who she was until she started laughing and all the men around her started laughing at his confusion. But she seems to have just engaged in warfare as a matter of course, defending her city, fighting the various petty grudges. Others are much harder to tell. There's a woman recorded in the Count of Nemours' retinue who was killed at Boromir, fighting against the Scots during the early, it was 1332, fighting just part of the retinue. We don't actually know anything about her except for, the Scots had a duel. One of the Scots had a duel with her. After the battle, they realised when they removed the armour she was a woman, which surprised them. Then you've got Great Margot, the Flemish standard bearer at Russebeck, again, she must have been a pretty formidable woman because she's a standard bearer, which is not a role you give on a strictly political basis. You have to have martial skills. Presumably, she was like the others of the town and, was motivated by civic pride and not wanting to be under the French king's rule.
To what extent would you say that it's unusual that we don't have more information than we do? I mean, is this sort of an accident of survival thing, or was there some kind of intentional excising of women from the record, or was it, I mean, as you suggested, just that a lot of the time they weren't noticed?
Probably a combination of all three. Of course, there were some discussions from medieval philosophers and religious scholars on the subject of women fighting, because Aristotle had mentioned Plato coming to the conclusion that, yes, women should be allowed to fight. They basically went through the whole arguing both sides and came down on the decision that no, women are just too weak-willed and too physically weak to fight. And it's been noted by, especially by Megan McLaughlin, that after the 13th century, the sources often speak a little bit more negatively about women who decided to fight. So there's probably some deliberate, we don't want to talk about them side of things. But on the other hand, one of the reasons we know so much about women in armies after the early modern period is we've just got so many more sources written by the soldiers themselves, the common men. Of course, increased literacy, better survival of records. So you've got them talking about people they've known. You've got them writing the biography of women as a way of shaming men into fighting in unpopular wars. It's a bit harder in the Middle Ages to get away with that. Probably often the biggest references to women fighting come from the other side, either an amazement of finding these women or possibly as a way of othering. For instance, some of the Muslim sources or Byzantine sources speak of many armed women and queens with retinues of Amazons coming to fight the Crusades, which we know didn't happen. But it's a way of showing how barbarous the enemy was. On the other hand, they do record some almost certainly real instances, because they said, I was walking across the battlefield and I recognised that these were women. Or I was speaking to this man who raided the camp, and there was a woman in a green dress, and she was shooting so well that by the time they'd killed her, they had to retreat, and they brought her bow back to show to Saladin. So it's a combination of things.
Yeah. So I think that then gets us to the next thing, where, of course, there's women who seem to have fought because of the circumstances. Now, you didn't elaborate there, because I assume you wanted to elaborate here. I mean, what sorts of circumstances might compel a woman to fight?
Yeah, so sieges especially. We hear of instances from, say, the Siege of Thessalonica, when the Normans were trying to conquer it in the 1180s. Women would actually, some of the women were bringing up, stones, pots of quicklime, etc. Others were throwing the stones, and others seem to have others made for themselves textile armour from rags and rushes, and wrapped their heads in thick cloth to serve as helmets, and actually fought on top of the walls to defend the walls. The stone throwing is a pretty common instance in terms of sieges. Even when armies broke into the towns, sometimes women would be throwing rocks from the roofs. At one point, when John Hawkwood was besieging Florence, the Florentine chroniclers tell us that they thought that the White Company was about to break down the gates and rampage for the city. So all the women brought the rocks up to the windows so they could throw it on the soldiers fighting down beneath. There's an instance in the 100 Years' War back in the what year was it? 1360 something, where the French were trying to kick out the English from the town, and the English obviously had the support of the townspeople, and so they threw rocks from the windows, especially the women. The siege of Caen, it's not specifically said that it was women throwing rocks, but when you look at all the other towns, they're probably throwing rocks. Then, of course, you've got the siege camps. I mentioned it earlier. So the siege of Damietta in the Fifth Crusade. There was a relieving force attempting to get reinforcements into the town, and as they were being beaten off by the Crusaders, the women fell on them and killed a good number of them. Sometimes it was just a opportunistic attack in the so raiding force going through, get separated. The women decide, well, we outnumber these guys. They don't look so tough. So they go and kill a few of them and take off with their horses. So there's a lot of instances, mostly during sieges, but sometimes they could, in the countryside, band together and take down a small group of men.
Yeah, so it seems to be a lot of these more kind of general patterns where we may not have a huge number of specific examples, but they give us a sense of, actually, here's how this could happen pretty regularly.
Yeah.
We've got these two major categories of women who very clearly directly fought, but also, obviously, as would later happen in the early modern period, there are clearly a number of supporting roles as well, performed predominantly by women. So could we go into those a bit, please?
Yeah. So we're talking about, start from the garrisons or armies moving through friendly territory. Of course, women often acted as small merchants. So Jean de Bouille mentions in his Le Jovencel, I apologise to all our French listeners, that the merchants supplying the garrisons were often women. And of course, women in civilian life sold small goods quite often. That was a way many of them made their living. So, of course, they would be selling to any passing army or garrison. Within the armies themselves, again, looking at the early modern period, women would act as sutlers. They would go outside the army camp and buy food off the population, or in many cases, steal it. We shouldn't think they were any less likely or less willing to pillage than the men. Again, at the siege of Damietta, we know that women held market stalls there because they were required to stand guard by virtue of holding a stall. That was right towards the end when it was getting a bit desperate, and a good number of crusaders had left. So, which is actually, the siege of Damietta is a wonderful example of the roles of women. I say it's almost unique in the level of detail, just because the circumstances conspired and the sources were focused enough on women that we get a wide variety. So in a marching army, in some instances we know that there were no water mills or windmills, so that they had to grind the grain manually. So the women would have done that. The cooking, a lot of that would have been done by women. We've got Guillaume Guillat writing about the French army in 1304, marching off to fight the Flemish. So, of course, accompanied by the women. A lot of them would have been the ones who, as you were saying, were digging chimneys and ovens into the banks of nearby hills and ditches in order to cook the food. And when you look at the great companies in the 100 Years' War, would have been a huge tale of women, perhaps as many as half as many as the men, and they would have been doing all this: the cooking, the washing, the sewing, grinding grain, pretty well every bit of woman's work. But while we think of stereotypical women's work in that sense, we also have to remember that in the Middle Ages, women performed manual labour as a matter of course. So rural women, they would have, apart from the usual carrying of water, they were heavily involved in harvesting the wheat, harvesting olives, grapes, whatever. And it's not light labour. It's very heavy physical labour. In the towns, we know women would be carrying soil, stones, breaking rocks for cobbles, heavily involved in construction trade. So we had all these women in the civilian life who are used to hard physical labour, have these skills. And we know Charles the Bold, during the siege of Neuss, he organised 3,000 odd women into companies. And they performed a lot of the engineering for the siege works, digging trenches, etc., etc. Crusades, women were heavily involved in weaving the sides for the siege towers, filling in the ditches, all that. So that's very rarely. The Crusades, it's very well known, but outside, in just general medieval warfare in Europe, it's not often thought about these manual labour jobs that women were doing.
Yeah, just before we move on to discussing the last category, I do want to elaborate in this a little bit, because obviously with one of the questions with the early modern period is to what extent and when there may have emerged this concept of civilians and or sort of non-combatants with an army who nevertheless had some kind of special protection. And what I was wondering is there any sort of analogous situation in the medieval period where perhaps the women that accompanied these armies were considered, if they were not actively involved in fighting, would have been considered some kind of non-combatant? Or if, for instance, we see at Damietta that a group of women actually did suddenly take up arms and attack an enemy force, that if they were actually seen as prospective combatants who just might not be combatants at any one moment.
If you look at the various religious, moral, military theoretical texts, it's assumed that women aren't having an active role in warfare. They should be protected, not molested, etc., etc. It's very hard to tell in real life how they were regarded. It's possible in some instances, going back to Charles the Bold, during the Battle of Merton, there were large numbers of women who were armoured in the camp. Were they acting as camp guards? Was this something that was normal for the Burgundians? Hard to say. If they were normal, well, the Swiss couldn't tell until they'd removed their armour. So perhaps many of the women who were performing opportunistic violence weren't even recognised as women up until they either took the armour off to reveal themselves and save themselves, or until they were killed. But of course, another case is Damietta. Probably the Muslims were a little bit surprised to find out the women were attacking. And I'd say probably most armies wouldn't necessarily expect women who were dressed as women to put up much resistance, unless, of course, in a siege.
Yeah, so I think we've covered here, I suppose, women who are actively involved with armies in some degree voluntarily. But there's, of course, kind of a thornier issue of what were relations like between women and soldiers in general, both of their own side, so to speak, and of others.
Yeah, this is where things get a little bit dark. In general, if you're a woman with an army coming through the area, especially if it was a hostile army, yeah, you're wanting to head for the hills or the nearest town. Even, especially if you've got a long-term occupying force, it is particularly not good for women. We know the great companies in southern France, often they would get hold of local men, and apart from using them to find out the best targets of opportunity for ransom or stealing money, we do know in some instances these men suggested women who could be taken or lured the women to the company, who were then forcibly made to be prostitutes, or I should say in the Middle Ages, prostitution was not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of women might be because this was the best way to survive, but would become prostitutes for a season or a few years. But this is definitely not what happened with a lot of passing armies. There's one chronicle that mentions how a group of women were taken from a town for the use of the army. It's probably not entirely sexual, probably also the usual labour, cooking, washing, but that is the dark side of the medieval armies. And even for a friendly army passing through, women would often have to be very, very careful. And especially, was it to the point where if a woman was captured for any length of time, it was generally assumed that she'd been molested, even if she hadn't. And we know in some cases noble women had no violence done to them, but it was assumed that it had been, so they were sent off to nunneries or all that, which I think is pretty telling in how armies were expected to treat women. There's one example, of course, some of these women might be forced against their will into actual relationships. There's a woman called Janet, who was the long-term mistress of William Gold, who was one of John Hawkwood's subordinates. And we only know about her because she managed to escape him in the end in 1377, about then. But for some years, he'd obviously trusted her, and he certainly felt affection for her. But she'd been going to Venice to handle his financial affairs. But she eventually ran away and got married to another man. And he tried very hard to get her back. We don't know whether or not he managed to. But from what he reveals of her life, it's very, very, very strongly suggesting that she was unwilling to begin with. She'd been forced to it, and may have made accommodations later in her life until she managed to find a way to escape.
Yeah, obviously the dark stuff isn't to be completely abandoned. I think it's important to be sure to leave that in. But I think I did want to come full circle a little bit, because after my quip about the army, you did mention that a lot of women wore armour potentially just as a status symbol. And this got me thinking about someone whom we very obviously haven't mentioned, which is, of course, Joan of Arc.
Yes.
And so I guess we probably need to talk about her now, and sort of where does she fit in the overall pattern? Because from what we've been discussing, it's been pretty clear that women were pretty regularly involved at quite low levels of medieval warfare. And Joan of Arc would seem to stand out as kind of exceptional in just how prominent she seems to have been.
Yeah, well, especially in the 11th, 12th century, we have fairly significant numbers of women who are actively involved in commanding armies. When you've got most famously Matilda of Tuscany, who by the time she was fighting the Holy Roman Empire was a widow. And yeah, she seems to be, she was, from all the contemporary sources from her period, she was the brains behind the defence of the papacy against the Holy Roman Emperor. Interestingly, the Anglo-Normans spoke very, very highly of her, and they assumed that she wore armour during all this, but she didn't. She deliberately cultivated a feminine persona, so always wearing the dresses, doing the typical feminine thing, even as she inspected siege works, gave directions for how to defend. Her rough contemporary, Sicilgaita, who was the wife of Robert Guiscard, she commanded one wing of the army at the Battle of Dyrrhachium. She was fully armoured. We don't think, well, modern scholarship doesn't think she actually fought. Anna Comnena is the best most detailed reference to her, and she says that Sikelgaita rallied her wing when it broke, charging them, waving her spear, which was William the Conqueror did the exact same thing at Battle of Hastings. So the waving of the spear was probably to rally with the pennon. And then, of course, that went back into attack. But they're not unique. Richild of Hainaut in the 11th century, she commanded her force at the Battle of Cassel. One woman called Girnild captured the town of Cervera in Spain. Catalonia. I'm probably getting in trouble there. She built a tower there, ended up being recognised as the Castellan. Isabel of Conque. She is one person, we're not entirely sure if she fought, but she certainly rode fully armoured with her knights as a regular matter of course. And Orderic Vitalis was very, very complimentary of her. And he's a bit ambiguous, which may mean she did actually fight. So heaps more examples. Even interestingly, you get into the 14th century. During the War of the Breton Succession, one of the arguments of the Montfortists was that women were far too fragile and incapable of commanding in war or dispensing justice. And all three of the Jeans who participated in Jean de Montfort, Jean de Clisson, and I always pronounce her name wrong, Jean de Penthièvre. I apologise to our French listeners. All three at various points commanded armies and quite successfully. Jean de Montfort, also known as Fiery Joanna, at the siege of Hennebont, led a sally that burnt the enemy's camp and siege engines, broke through to a nearby town, picked up reinforcements, and broke all the way back through the siege lines to bring a large number of men-at-arms back to the town. But yeah, all throughout the 11th through to the 14th century, we do have a good number of women who commanded armies, whether in army armour or not. It does seem to fall off a bit at the 15th century. In Italy, there's probably more examples later on, in the late 15th century. But at the time about Joan of Arc, yeah, she is fairly unique in that particular stage of the 15th century.
So getting back to that, I guess, that raises the question of what about Jeanne d'Arc made her so prominent in later myth, later mythos, if actually simply being a woman and commanding an army was kind of typical in a way. Not the absolute norm, but still...
Yes, far from abnormal.
Unusual, yeah.
Part of it is definitely because she was a peasant girl who heard voices from God, and who managed to turn things around. I'm honestly not up with the historiography about whether or not she was just a status, in symbolic command. I know there's some fairly recent discussion with that in terms of English versus French views. English, ironically, being more in favour of her having actual command. Again, not up on the full historiography, but I think there's a lot of romanticism involved in depictions of her because, again, of who she was, how she came to command, and the fact that the French fortunes did turn once she was on the scene.
Yeah, basically a sort of lightning in a bottle combination of just happening to be the right person in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, exactly.
In a way that just quite a lot of others weren't. I think it's probably no coincidence that France, being a country that survived the Middle Ages, has probably produced a much more easily familiar set of myths than, say, stuff about the siege of Dyrrhachium involving Normans and Byzantines that genuinely no longer exist.
Yeah.
Even in any sort of continued form, yeah. So I did a brief course on medieval warfare in my first year of undergrad, and I recall one of the things we looked at, because it was a very source-heavy course, was a bit of Christina Pizan on siegecraft.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, kind of, to what extent did women get involved in the intellectual discussion around warfare, quite apart from the actual direct physical involvement? Or does Christina Pizan stand out as this one unusually prolific author who wrote in a huge variety of things?
Christine de Pizan is definitely unusual, in as much as that she updated Vegetius and had summarised other authors of her day to compose like a general handbook. And of course, she obviously spoke to various commanders of her time, because her description of a siege is a wonderfully unique document. It is probably the most detailed. Well, of course, it lists how many nails you need for the siege. Description of how to attack or defend a castle. We know Eleanor of Aquitaine had editions of Vegetius prepared, but in general, women don't, as far as we can tell, seem to have had much influence on the discussion, the philosophy, or the spread of the knowledge of military history. Although Christine de Pizan's book of deeds and of chivalry was very influential right through the 15th century. It was one of the first books translated into English, I believe, by Caxton. Printed books. But we also probably shouldn't forget that Christine de Pizan mentions that women should know about warfare. And there may be more to that than we think. There's a family in England, the Hottots, and we have two interesting women in that family. One is Dionysia, who married into the Hottots. Again, I apologize to our English listeners because I'm definitely pronouncing that wrong. But during the anarchy, she just seems to have, for a lark, gone out and jousted with the enemy knight, knocked him off his horse, and taken it all the way back to her castle. She was a daughter. She wasn't in command of the castle. She just seems to have done it, I don't know, just as a bit of fun. And later on, in the 1390s, Agnes Hottot fought in her father's place in a duel over a piece of land. And when she married into the Dudleys, they adopted a woman in a helmet to honour that. So we probably shouldn't necessarily dismiss that women didn't know much about the siegecraft, even those who we don't find commanding armies. It may well be that more. I mean, I'm not saying that many of them were trained in combats. The Hottots may have been particularly unique, but the theory of war, I think, was probably much more common than we imagine.
Well, thank you. I think on that note, that pretty much wraps the main thing. So thank you for coming on.
Oh, that's all right. Thanks for having me.
And perhaps we will see you again soon.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.